financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the world, and were administered by the Pardee School of Global Studies and BU Research. I'm really excited to introduce to you and celebrate with you a new book by one of our colleagues. But before I start today's event, let me just invite you to a couple things that we're doing over the next week. Today we're featuring work through our Land Use and Livelihoods Initiative. One of our other initiatives is called the Global China Initiative that looks at the social, economic, and environmental impacts of Chinese overseas investment. And tomorrow morning we'll have one of our Global China Research Colloquia at 9 a.m. and we'll have a presentation by our own Xia Li, and she'll be presenting early results on a paper called Physical Climate Risks and Chinese Overseas Investments. We invite you to that. And then next week, on Monday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, we have a very special and important event called Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery. The GDP Center has been working with colleagues in Pakistan, Chile, and Germany to put together a proposal to help some of the emerging market and developing countries that are facing significant debt concerns right now under the COVID crisis, and have a proposal to provide debt relief for them, along with a pact that the new fiscal space that they would gain from such debt relief would be calibrated towards the Paris Climate Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. That event will be keynoted by the Honorable Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Well, let's move to today. I'm really excited to celebrate a new book by my good friend, my colleague, and my associate dean, Henrik Selin. Henrik Selin and Noelle Eckley Selin have just published this new book called Mercury Stories, Understanding Sustainability Through a Volatile Element. Henrik's an associate professor here of international relations at the Pardee School. He's also one of the coordinators of the Land Use and Livelihoods Initiative at the Global Development Policy Center. Professor Selin will give an overview of some of the main arguments in his book, which if you want to click on the chat here, you can see that we've got links to it. And then we'll open it up, have a global conversation about, you can ask him questions about it. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, you will see a little Q&A button. What I ask you to do is first, introduce yourself, tell us who you are. And second, ask him a question. And after his presentation, I will field a cluster of questions and let him take 3 or 4, and then we can do a couple rounds of those within the hour. So I'm really excited to introduce my friend and colleague, and first and foremost, start off with a big congratulations. This is an excellent new book from MIT Press, which I highly recommend to everyone here. Thanks so much, and take it away, Henrik.
Oh, thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much for that presentation. Can I get to share my screen here? Perfect. And I'm going to do this. So thank you very much, Kevin. Yes. So I have a new book out called Mercury Stories, Understanding Sustainability Through a Volatile Element. And I have co-authored this book with Noelle Eckley Selin, who is an associate professor over at MIT. And my background is more in the social sciences, and Noelle's background is more in the natural sciences and engineering. And this is really a collaborative project between the two of us. We have jointly and individually worked on Mercury-related issues for almost two decades now. Our first joint publication on Mercury came out almost 15 years ago. So this is sort of pulling together a lot of research that we have done over the past 20 years, and then also a lot of primary research that we did over the last couple of years to pull the book together. So in the book, we are telling stories. We are telling Mercury stories. But one of the things that we're arguing that these are stories that go beyond Mercury. They really are sustainability stories. And here we have a couple of pictures, and they're all from Minamata and Kumamoto in Japan. And for when a lot of people hear mercury or think about mercury, they unfortunately think about Minamata and Minamata disease. And Minamata disease occurred in Minamata, Japan, and was discovered in the 1950s. And it was caused by high levels of methyl mercury in seafood in Minamata Bay. So when then the local fishers and their family ate fish from Minamata Bay, they got very sick and several hundred people died. Now, however, Minamata is also known as the place where the international community came together and adopted the first global agreement on a heavy metal, the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And the area that was contaminated by methyl mercury in Minamata Bay has been cleaned. It has been dredged. It was put in a landfill, and then that landfill have been turned into an eco park. And both Noelle and I were in Minamata and then in Kumamoto in 2013 when the Global Mercury Agreement was adopted. And part of the reason for why we call it Mercury Stories and why we tell story is that at the beginning of the very first chapter of the book, we tell a story about storytelling. So many of the victims of Minamata disease in Japan have struggled to be recognized. They faced social stigma and discrimination, and they fought very, very hard to get recognition, both from the Japanese government, but also the international community, of really being suffering from Minamata disease and getting compensation. And one of the ways in which they have drawn attention through this is through storytelling. So for victims of Minamata disease, storytelling has been a very important message of getting their story out. And we are sort of building on that and continuing on that tradition when we tell our Mercury stories. And we believe that storytelling is not just an efficient way of trying to learn about the past or the present, but also a very useful way to think about the future, as in what might a more equitable, just, and sustainable future actually look like. Now, mercury enters the environment through many different processes, and some of these are natural. So for instance, volcanic eruptions or the natural weathering of rocks releases mercury from the Earth's crust, so it starts cycling in the environment. But over almost 8,000 years, people have also interacted with various mercury compounds and have then also added to the amount of mercury that is taken out of the Earth's crust and then start cycling through the environment. And so the graph on the left here shows that levels of mercury pollution has increased dramatically over the last 200 years, sort of coinciding with the Industrial Revolution. And that huge increase is then the result of human activities. Now, the fact that when you dig mercury out of the ground and then use it, and it ends up in the local environment, and it can cause local human health problem. That has been known for a very, very long time. But it wasn't really until the very first global mercury assessment in 2002, as in a little bit less than 20 years ago, that mercury was established as a global pollutant. So now science tells us very conclusively that some forms of mercury can stay in the atmosphere long enough that it can travel across continents and in fact, even on a global scale. So with the discovery that mercury cycles not only through societies, but also the environment on a global scale, became a very important impetus for the adoption of the Minamata Convention. And it's also important to recognize that because mercury is so persistent, that it stays in the environment for such a long time, that the legacy of past pollution is still very much present, and today's pollution is tomorrow's legacy pollution. So here we have a picture of sushi. And if you do eat sushi, especially if you eat something like tuna or swordfish, there will be small levels of methyl mercury in that piece of tuna. Over centuries, mercury has become so widespread that it's found in every corner of the globe. There is not a single region that is not untouched by mercury pollution that is the result of human activities. But some of that methyl mercury in that piece of tuna that you might have for lunch later today, some of that might be the origin from a coal-fired power plant from a couple of years ago. But it can also be the result of mercury mining from 300 or 400 or 500 years ago. So on the left, there is a picture from Almadén, Spain, in southern Spain. And the mercury mine in Almadén is the world's largest mercury mine. It is estimated that maybe as much as a third of all mercury that have been intentionally used comes from this single mine in Almadén. That mine closed a couple of decades ago, but it was in operation for almost 2,000 years, going back to at least Roman times. So that means that mercury from this mine and its mining district have then continued cycling. So it could very well be that the tuna that you're eating here in Boston have traces of mercury going back to Spain 300, 400, 500 years ago. So if we're then looking at how the Minamata Convention on Mercury developed, was that, as I mentioned earlier, the 2002 UNEP Global Mercury Assessment established mercury as a global pollutant. It's something that travels globally in the environment. The initial response by the world's countries was to create a global mercury partnership. This mercury partnership consisted of voluntary cooperation. So countries and other stakeholders that wanted to develop further measures on mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants, or mercury used in artisanal small-scale gold mining, or mercury in products and processes could do so. However, in 2009, those very same countries agreed that the voluntary approach was not enough, that we needed a legally binding agreement that focused on the mercury issue, that took a comprehensive approach to mercury use and mercury pollution. So 5 different meetings were held on 3 different continents between 2010 and 2013. And then Noelle and I attended several of these, then ending up at the adoption of the Minamata Convention in 2013 at that meeting in Minamata and Kumamoto that I mentioned earlier. And the Minamata Convention then entered into force in 2017. So we now have a global legally binding framework for countries to cooperating on mercury issues moving forward. And the Minamata Convention also takes a comprehensive life cycle approach. So he focuses on the origins of mercury, focus on mercury mining, the trade in mercury, the use in mercury, the storage and disposal of mercury. Here, it's a somewhat wonkish figure, but it's from UNEP, it's from the United Nations Environment Program. They put together a supply and trade report on mercury a couple of years ago, and this one focused on the year for 2015. And one of the things I just want to highlight here on the left-hand side is that a lot of mercury that has been used historically have come from mercury mining, as I mentioned, and that's still true. But also a growing number of mercury is now not coming from primary mercury mining, but coming from recovering recycling, as you have there at the bottom. So for instance, you might use mercury in a particular manufacturing process. As you then phase out that mercury-based manufacturing process, you have excess mercury, and that mercury can then go to be used in, for instance, artisanal small-scale gold mining, or it can be used in certain products. But then on the right-hand side, you then have the environment. And one thing to bear in mind here, that while we know that mercury cycles in the environment, the extent of how much mercury and exactly where it is in the environment still remains at least partially unclear. So what we did in a paper a couple of years ago, we tried to see the relevance of different Minamata Convention article with respect to the flows of mercury. So on the left-hand side, you have mercury fluxes by sector, as in how much mercury, relatively speaking, is used in mercury added products, how much is used in dental, how much is used in VCM and chloralkali, which is 2 chemicals manufacturing process, how much is used in artisanal small-scale gold mining, and others. And then on the right-hand side, you then have the corresponding articles in the Minamata Convention. And what is then trying to map out here is the sort of relative importance of these articles when it comes to the flows of mercury. But should also note that there is a fair amount of uncertainty also in these numbers, but it sort of gave us a slightly better idea of how different aspects of the Minamata Convention matches up with different aspects of the mercury issue. So in our book, we're asking 4 research questions. The first one is, what are the main components of systems relevant to sustainability? So we are interested in the Mercury issue, and we're looking at Mercury from a sustainability perspective. And what we then decided to do was to take a systems approach to analyzing Mercury as a sustainability issue. So therefore, our first question is to then ask what main components of systems are relevant to sustainability? What are the main components of the system? The second question is, in what ways do the main components of these systems interact? And since we're not interested only in sort of understanding Mercury as a sustainability issue, but also thinking about intervention and sort of moving the Mercury systems to a higher degree of sustainability, our third research question was, how can actors intervene in these systems to affect change? How can actors take steps to change the way in which these systems operate to move them to a higher degree of sustainability? And the fourth question tries to then synthesize lessons and insights from the first three research questions by asking what insights can be drawn from analyzing these systems. And the way that we do that in our book is that we are introducing what we are calling the HTE framework, the Human Technical Environmental Framework, and then coupled with a matrix-based approach. So we are arguing that systems relevant to sustainability consist of three material components and two non-material components. So the material components are people, humans, people and communities. They consist of technologies and infrastructure, and then the environment and ecosystems. And these three material components interact in different ways in the context of institutions and knowledge, which are the two non-material components. So another way to sort of think about this is to then sort of look at the HTE framework and the matrix-based approach in this way. So in the first step is to identify the system components. So which are the main human, technical, environmental, institutional, and knowledge component of relevance here? And this can then be done at different levels of aggregation. So if we take the human components, for instance, so a human component could be an individual factory worker, an individual seafood consumer, or an individual doctor. But we discovered fairly quickly that in order to analyze these kinds of systems, it often makes more sense to do it at a more aggregate level. So for instance, think about all workers as one human component, or all seafood consumers as one human component, or all medical doctors as one human component. And similar with technical, so one scrubber in one chimney of a coal-fired power plant could be seen as one technical component, or all scrubbers in all chimneys of all coal-fired power plants could be seen as a technical component, and so forth. And then we're then using a matrix-based approach to both identify these components and then also look at the next step, which is interaction between the material components, the human, technical, environmental components, in the context of the non-material components, and identify pathways. And that's where we have the matrix on the right. And the matrix is read row first and column second. And then in step three is that based on the interaction matrix and the pathways that we identify past interventions done by particular interveners to see how they have changed either individual system components or how the system components interact, and the degree to which that had advanced steps towards greater sustainability, and then draw insights and lessons from that. So a slightly different way to do an interaction matrix would be like this. So since it's row first and column second, that means that the top right corner is 1-1. That's people interact with other people. That's human-human interaction. And 1-2 is then human technical interaction, as in people use technologies and products. And 1-3 is human environmental. That's a human component interacting with an environmental component, such as people harvest resources, but discharge pollutants into ecosystem. So these kinds of interactions can then be filled out throughout the interaction matrix. I'm not going to go through all of those 9 squares, but I'm happy to go back and talk more about the interaction matrices if anyone have any questions about that. And then the intervention matrix operates the same way. As again, think about it as row first, the column second. So one intervention into a human-human interaction in 1-1 is then an intervention that targets people, the way that people behave, or the way that people interact. Or another intervention that is in 1-2, then that is an intervention into the way that human components interact with technical components. So it sort of changes the way that people use technologies. And 1-3 would be an example of an intervention into a case where there are human components interacting with environmental components. So such an intervention could, for instance, be changes that targets the direct impact on people on ecosystem. So in the book, we are using this HGE framework to look at 5 different Mercury systems. So one thing that we talked about was, okay, should we see this as one consistent, or one singular Mercury system? And we decided that was really not a particularly useful way, because the Mercury issue is so complex and so diverse. So in order to make more sense of the full scope of the Mercury issues, we are looking at 5 individual Mercury systems, as in we are telling 5 individual Mercury stories. So in chapter 3, we are looking at the global human technical environmental cycling, that we are looking at the global societal environmental movements of Mercury. In the next chapter, we are looking at issues of Mercury and human health. And in the following chapter thereafter, we are then looking at Mercury in terms of energy that's focused mostly on the burning of coal emitting mercury, but also sort of other stationary sources that emits mercury into the atmosphere. The assets and liabilities chapter looks at the use of mercury, intentional uses of mercury in various manufacturing processes and products. And then the last empirical chapter here looks at the use of mercury in artisanal and small-scale gold mining. And just to illustrate a little bit about how we are doing our analysis using the HDE framework in the book, I'm just going to focus very briefly on the chapter on assets and liability, just to sort of give you a little better idea of how we use the framework and how we're looking at the mercury issue from a sustainability perspective. So here are then the kinds of system components that we identified for this particular Mercury system. So as you can see here, there are a fairly high level of aggregation, right? So one human component is producers and consumers of mercury added products and other goods made using mercury. Another human components are people living near mercury discharges or contaminated sites. And another one is people living far from mercury discharges. Examples of technical components are then mercury in production processes or mercury in stockpiles and landfills. And examples of environmental components that we are focusing on this system is contaminated sites or geological reservoirs of mercury. And then examples of institutional components are, for instance, markets for mercury added products and goods made using mercury, or national and local laws and regulations. And examples of knowledge components are then, for example, properties of mercury. What kind of properties do different mercury compounds have? Knowledge about mercury-based production development and production techniques, or knowledge about health impacts from mercury exposure. So after we have then identified these system components and put them into our matrix, not sure here what just happened there. I tried to move to the next slide, but it doesn't want to do that. Okay, here's the next slide. To looking at then system interactions and then sort of tracing pathways. So one interaction is then Cinnabar ore provides mercury for use in products and processes. And then another interaction is producers and consumers sell and buy mercury added products and other goods made using mercury. And then the third one is mercury added products and other goods made using mercury that provide and benefits and harm to people. And what we can then do when we have these interactions is then to trace these interactions through pathways. So if we were to put those three into the interaction matrix, it would look like this. So this is just another illustration of what we had there on the other one. The way that we are then illustrating these interaction pathways is in the books is through this box diagrams. So here again, we then have the same interaction, but we are then, the same interactions that I illustrated earlier, but we're then using these kinds of diagrams to illustrate them in the book and to help us trace pathways. So this then particular interaction pathway is commercial mercury benefits and harm, where then economic and social conditions and geological reservoirs containing mercury prompt the development of consumer goods that then provide human benefits, but also causing harm. And we're then using these kinds of interaction pathways to sort of try to get a better sense of some of the main ways in which this system operates. And then in the next step, when we then look at interventions, so one intervention here is then to target the interaction in 1.2, where producers and consumers sell and buy mercury added products and other goods made using mercury. Here, one type of intervention is then that national and local government adopt laws and regulation that control mercury use in products and processes. And a second type of intervention then instead focuses on the interactions in 2.2, which then interaction is mercury in products and production processes influence quantities of mercury in commerce and stockpiles. Here, a particular intervention would be that industries and experts design mercury-free products and production processes. So if you're moving from a mercury-based production process to a mercury-free production process, that is then an intervention that reduces the need for using mercury, therefore reducing the amount of mercury that is released into the environment and end up causing damage to human health. And one of the things that we're looking at in the book that we talk about throughout the chapters is this notion of benefits and harm, because the mercury issue is a very useful way to think about sustainability over a very long period of time, as in humans have intentionally interacted with mercury compounds for at least 8,000 years. So there's a long history to draw from here. But one thing that we discover and that we analyze is that relationships between benefits and harms can be very complex. And that then sort of helps us inform our thinking around sustainability and sustainability issues. So as I mentioned, a lot of mercury comes from mercury mining, primary mercury mining. And throughout those 2,000 years that the mercury mine in Almadane was in operation, there have been a lot of human suffering. It was only recently that the people that worked in the mine were salaried workers. For most of the history, the people in the mine were enslaved people, were convicts, and other forms of forced labor. And there were often very high death tolls in mercury mining. At the same time, that mercury that was extracted from the mercury mine in Almadane and elsewhere facilitated the development of the mercury thermometer. The mercury thermometer was developed in the early 1700s. So for about 300 years, the mercury thermometer was the dominating technology for accurately measuring temperatures. And the use of the mercury thermometer in medicine and healthcare greatly helped protect human health. And also this helped with a lot of important scientific discoveries. There's the oxygen atom. So mercury helped with the discovery of oxygen, for instance. So on the one hand, we then have the horrible conditions in the mercury mines, but on the other hand, we then also have the benefits of having access to the mercury thermometer for 300 years. You have also related to energy efficiency. The bottom right, there is a compact fluorescent light bulb. It actually comes from our house. We took it down a couple of days ago. So when that was introduced, that's a light bulb that contains mercury, but it's much, much more energy efficient than the older incandescent light bulbs. So for instance, and that reduces the need for energy. So if you get your energy from a coal-fired power plant, by having a more energy efficient light bulb reduces the amount of need of energy that you get from a coal-fired power plant. And this is not only good from a climate change perspective, but also from a mercury perspective, because if you burn less coal, you will emit less mercury into the environment. So this issue of benefits and harms and assets and liability is something that I'm more than happy to talk more about during the Q&A, but it's something that we see as very important for thinking about sustainability. So just round up with a couple of brief selected insights for sustainability. So we developed the HTE framework and the matrix-based approach to help analysts examine and inform sustainability challenges. And we are using it to study the mercury issue. But the way that we develop the framework and the way that the matrix-based approach is set up, it can be used to analyze a whole range of other sustainability issues, as in it's not a mercury specific framework. So we created a website, mercurystories.org, that contains more background information about the framework and the matrix-based approach and how it can be applied to other cases. So for instance, one of the other cases that are up on our website is plastics. So you can use the same approach that we do for mercury for examining plastic issues, for instance. So this is sort of a toolbox of methods. We are using mostly qualitative information and data in our book, but you can also use the framework if you have access to more quantitative data, and then build theories and draw insights that helps us understand sustainability. And we are then also arguing that there's a need for further linking detailed analysis of empirical examples of interactions with analytical approaches. So part of the reason for why we wrote this book, because we believe that in the broad area of sustainability science, there is currently a lack of really in-depth empirical cases, or studies of empirical cases, as there's a lot of discussions around methodology and theorizing, but what we really need is more empirical studies across different areas that can then operate as an empirical foundation for further development of methodologies and framework, the way that we are trying to do with the HDE framework and our matrix-based approach. And then towards the end of the book, we're then also talking about that ultimately here, it's not about understanding sustainability. It's about advancing sustainability. It's about helping to inform action that actually improves human well-being today and in the future. So it's very much research and analysis that have a clear empirical goal, a clear sort of normative goal, if you want to use that word, of helping to improve human well-being today and in the future. And on that, I will end. And again, I will say that this has always been a collaborative project between me and Noelle. So even if I did a presentation here today, it's very much a project and a book that is co-authored and between the two of us jointly. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions that people might have.
Thanks so much, Henrik. Great, fascinating presentation. If you look in the chat, you can get links to the book and to a blog piece that Professor Selin put together on this, in addition to a musical playlist of songs related to Mercury. If you go to your bottom right-hand corner here of your Zoom link, please click on the Q&A and introduce yourself and ask a few questions. I'll take a few of them and ask Professor Selin, and we can do a few clusters. I guess while we wait for folks to ask some questions, I'll ask one, an obvious one. What is your message to a new president of the United States that is pledged to, number one, re-engage in the multilateral system, and two, to pay more attention to science and global and environmental governance? I'm sure you've got something to say about that comes out of this book. And while Professor Selin is answering that question, again, please go into the Q&A box on the bottom, introduce yourself, and ask a question.
Yes, so one of the things that is actually interesting about, well, one of the many things that are interesting with the Minamata Convention on Mercury is that the first country that became a party to the Minamata Convention was in fact the United States. Now, this was, of course, negotiated and adopted during the Obama administration. But the Obama administration was very supportive of this, and it's sort of one of the areas where the United States have continued to be relatively engaged also over the last 4 years, in part because this is generally a convention that have been relatively low on the current administration's radar, as in it has not turned into be a high-profile agreement like the Paris Agreement on climate change, for instance. So in that sense, what I'm hoping that the incoming President-elect Biden, will do is very much continue the active engagement by the United States in securing a successful implementation of the Minamata Convention, and that involves working a lot with China and other countries. And then the second thing that I'm hoping that President-elect Biden will do is will stop some of the rollbacks that the current administration have done around the mercury issue, and that then includes mercury standards from coal-fired power plants in particular. So there's definitely things for the new administration to do, both domestically and internationally. I think you're muted, Kevin.
Oh, thanks a lot. Sorry about that. I have a handful of questions here. I'll ask maybe 3 or 4, and then you can respond, and we can do a round or 2 on that. One is from your colleague Minya here at the Pardee School. She says, what are actors to bring on board to create proactive conventions with respect to this issue? Another one also comes from your colleague at the Pardee School, our colleague at the Pardee School, Marjorie Miller. Says, very interesting. It's a topic I know nothing about, so I found it fascinating. Somewhat related to mine, she said, my question is, can you give us an example of a concrete policy recommendation with respect to mining that comes out of your takeaways on sustainability? Thanks. Those are, why don't you take these 2, and we'll take a few more.
Okay. To start with, so thanks, guys. To start with Min's questions, sort of focus on the Minamata Convention. So the Minamata Convention really sets up a framework for international collaboration. And I'll give one example. So one of the major sources of mercury emissions to the atmosphere is from coal-fired power plants. Now, unlike carbon dioxide, we actually do have technologies, as in you can put in end-of-pipe technologies in major stationary sources, including coal-fired power plants, and some of the more efficient technologies capture a close to 99, if not 100% of the mercury in coal before it gets released into the environment. So we have a technological solution to prevent mercury in coal from getting released into the atmosphere. So what the Minamata Convention does is that it sets out a framework that countries should apply best available techniques and technologies, as in should apply various end-of-pipe approaches or other strategies to reduce mercury emissions. But it then largely leaves each country to decide exactly what those standards should be, taken into consideration their own particular circumstances, as in it differs from so different coal-fired power plants have different capacities and operate in different ways, therefore you need different pollution control technologies. And countries are also operating under different socioeconomic conditions. So part of this is then sort of working with stakeholders in China, in India, in the United States, in Europe, and other places where there's a lot of coal burning, of then gradually increase the kind of control technologies that are being used in these. And I did mention the very proactive approach by the United States in the Minamata Convention, and I think that the same can largely be said for China, that this is an issue that the Chinese authorities take relatively seriously. They were very engaged in the negotiations. And they are embarking on a relatively stringent approach to regulating mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants. Now, part of that is then offset by the fact that they're building more coal-fired power plants, but nevertheless. In contrast, then India has taken a very, very different approach and are then arguing that this is too expensive, we can't do it, it's ruining the coal economy, and so forth. So there's lots to do with India and other countries, but it's sort of bringing together international organizations, UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, bringing together countries, bringing together private sector actors, including those that develop the pollution prevention technology, the owners and operators of coal-fired power plants, and embarking on this. And on Manjari's questions on mining, that's a very good question too, thank you. Just take one step back, and that is to say that mercury is used predominantly in gold mining, as in you use mercury to separate the gold from the ore. So it's in the process of separating that. Now, large gold mining corporations, so like large multinational corporations, have stopped using mercury. They're not using mercury in their extraction process anymore. They are typically using cyanide, so we can have a discussion whether using cyanide in mining is better than using mercury, but that's a different story. So today, mercury is almost exclusively used in artisanal and small-scale gold mining, as in individual people in 70 or 80 developing countries. So it's a growing problem in Latin America, Africa, and lots of Asia, where people, individual people or groups of 3 or 4 people go into the Amazon or wherever and are then digging gold or gold-containing ore out of the ground, and then they're using mercury often in fairly unsafe ways, as in when you burn off the mercury, a lot of it goes into the atmosphere. Maybe you have mercury out in the Amazon, it's rough, maybe you spill some of the mercury into the local river. Or if you burn off the mercury, you might do it indoors in very closed spaces. You can then get very high concentrations of mercury in the air. So a lot of policies focusing on mining is then both try to reduce the use of mercury in artisanal small-scale gold mining, that is sort of helping miners to use other ways of doing it. And also in those cases where they do in fact use mercury, increase measures of capturing the mercury before it's being released into the environment, make sure that if you do burn it, it's more in well-ventilated areas than in closed spaces and so forth. But this is then mercury policy aimed at reducing mercury emissions from a coal-fired power plant are going to be very, very, very different from policies try to reduce mercury use in artisanal small-scale gold mining in a rural part of Peru, for instance. So that's why we're also looking at the mercury issues through these 5 different mercury systems. It sort of helped us dig into these issues in more depth.
Great, I've got a couple more questions here. One is from Ximing Yang. Whoops, excuse me, I froze. A second here. One is from Ximing Yang, PhD student at the University of Southern California. She says, thank you for a great presentation. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Minamata and the UNFCCC? I know that Minamata does not directly regulate greenhouse gases, but it does have collateral climate benefits. She's working on a sectoral approach to mitigate greenhouse gases and wonders if Minamata offers any institutional innovations to solve something or to play a role in solving things that the UNFCCC have not been able to thus far. Then, and with great pleasure, I ask a question from Rebecca Dunn, a alum from the Pardee School and also an alum from the GDP Center. She says the Minamata Convention seems to be a concrete example of a sustainability success in the international arena. Are there any lessons that can be transferred to the Paris Agreement or future international climate agreements to make them more robust, binding, etc.? She just loves the history of mercury mining that you shared. Let me ask one more, if I may. This is by Cecilia Hahn Springer, a senior research associate here at the Global Development Policy Center, and she asks, is there a parallel between Mercury Stories and Lead Stories? Not knowing much about either, I see some similarity in the benefits of using each material becoming clear before the costs were well understood. Is lead regulation seen as a success that mercury regulation can emulate? And how do material properties of each element determine regulatory strategies? Why don't you take those, and we'll see if we have a couple more.
Yep, thank you. All great questions. I'll start with the first one. The relationship between the Minamata Convention and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the linkage between the mercury issue and the climate issue is an interesting one. So one of the things that the negotiators had to decide up front when they were started the negotiation on the Minamata Convention was, okay, how are we going to approach the linkages between coal burning and mercury? So one approach could have been, let's create the Minamata Convention as a convention that limits or phases out coal burning. If you do that, you solve the mercury issue. But countries really decided up front that that's not what they wanted to do, because there was a general belief that if the Minamata Convention was a convention that tried to limit coal burning, it would have been impossible to reach any kind of conclusion. As in, the Minamata Convention negotiation would have failed, as in countries like China and India and the United States and many others would have said, no, we are not going to sign on to any kind of treaty, mercury treaty, that tries to limit coal burning. So instead, countries decided, both industrialized and developing countries, that they were going to take a technology-based approach to mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants. So therefore, they have language on then the use of end-of-pipe technologies. So on the one hand, that means that the Minamata Convention, what it does on technology-based approaches to limit mercury emissions is quote unquote weaker than if the treaty had tried to phase out coal burning altogether. On the other hand, by going with that weaker standard, it was possible not only to conclude the treaty, but also to get countries like the United States, China, and India to join. So by that, you are then sort of advancing efforts to reduce mercury emissions. And it's probably clear that at least some of the countries that are now taking these steps, including China and to some degree India, probably would not have done that in the absence of the Minamata Convention, or they would at least not have done it as quickly as they are doing now. So that was sort of an example of a trade-off, as in if you have gone for really strict standards on coal burning, you wouldn't have had the Minamata Treaty. There wouldn't have been the Mercury Treaty. But by then going by slightly less ambitious approach, you have the mercury and then you get benefits from that. And as I said in the presentation, this doesn't just provide benefits now, but benefits long into the future, because some of that mercury that is being released from these coal-fired power plants are not just causing deposition problem and human health problems now in the next 5 years, but when some of our very, very distant relatives sit down to have a piece of tuna 300 years into the future, they are then going to have a little bit less mercury in that tuna because we were restricting mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants today. So in that sense, the negotiators tried to distance themselves from any efforts to reduce coal burning per se. And that's sort of, again, part of these discussions about assets and liabilities, but pros and cons and trade-offs that we have in the book. Rebecca's question on the Minamata Convention and lesson for others. Yes, I think that one of the things that sort of stand out to me about the Minamata Convention is that it is very much a convention where language and regulations are based in sound science, as in our scientific understanding of how mercury cycles through the environment. The importance of coal-fired power plants is recognized in the treaty. Similar, our understanding of mercury use in artisanal and small-scale gold mining and also more sort of social science research on interventions into mercury uses is also reflected in the way that the Minamata Convention is set up. So those global mercury assessments really helped to lay a foundation that then everyone sort of bought into. There was no discussions during the negotiation. Is mercury really that bad? Do we really need to do things like, is it actually that bad? It was more, yep, this is really bad, right? This is bad from an environmental perspective. It's bad from a human health perspective. Okay, so looking at the science, how can we then design this comprehensive life cycle approach to the mercury issue that is reflected in the Minamata Convention? And one of the provisions in the Minamata Convention is that there should also be periodic effectiveness evaluations. And the first one is coming up in 2023, at least start then. And this is a process that both Noelle and I have been involved with, working with the Minamata Convention Secretariat and UNEP Chemicals, to think about how to design an effectiveness evaluation. So this is another area where science helps guide efforts to design a structure that helps parties evaluate effectiveness, and then hopefully, if there are particular weaknesses that are identified through this effectiveness evaluation, help steer countries to take actions on that. And on the third question, parallels between mercury and lead, absolutely. So if one were to take the HTE framework and the matrix-based approach and apply it to another element, another substance, one of the ones that sort of stand out in my mind is definitely lead. As in many of the issues that we talk about in mercury in terms of mercury use, mercury pollution, cycling the environment, long periods of time, incremental progress versus very rapid progress, how to think about substitutes, the importance to combining, looking at both human components and environmental components and technical components when thinking about interaction and intervention. All of them stand out to me in lead as well. So if anyone has any interest of applying the HDE framework and the matrix-based approach to another issue, lead is definitely one of the ones that I would say, hey, this could be a really cool case study.
Great. I didn't see, there's one question here in the chat, so why don't I relay that one to you, and then you can make any closing remarks that you'd like. This one is from Lernamore Nyamadzanga, who is from Zimbabwe. And he says that mercury was just banned this year in Zimbabwe, but it's yet to be legislated. But what Lernamore knows for sure is that there are certainly still some artisanal miners that are still using it. They smuggle it in through what are characterized as very porous borders there. Do they not have alternatives? What kind of danger are they in, both on a regulatory side, if there's legislation, or in terms of their personal health? So maybe you can reply back to that, make any closing remarks that you'd like to make.
Yes. So ASGM, artisanal small-scale gold mining, is really the only area where mercury use is currently expanding. So the future of the mercury issue is very much tied to coal-fired power plants and coal burning, but it's also very closely tied to artisanal and small-scale gold mining. And one of the things that we have seen with the rapid increase in gold prices is that gold mining is much more profitable, as in even relatively small amounts of gold can give a poor miner a relatively large income. So that has led to a large influx of people into the ASGM sector. It's estimated that it might be somewhere between 10 and 15 million people worldwide that are engaged in ASGM. And that number, at least in the short term, is likely to go up. So even as countries are restricting use, so many countries have banned the use of mercury in ASGM, and other countries are severely restricting it. But if there's a will, there's a way. So what we have seen is a great increase in the illegal trade of mercury. And that's going to be one of the major challenges moving forward, is to sort of both stem the illegal flow of mercury, but then also working with individual mining communities to come up with mercury-free alternatives. And it's not like there's one size fit all here, because gold mining varies tremendously, because the type of ore that is being extracted differs. Some are sort of more alluvial, some are more hard rock. So that means that any kind of intervention of reducing mercury use has to be done, and not necessarily by miner, but pretty much mining community to mining community. It's not something that you can bring a lot of experts together at the UNEP headquarters in Kenya or UNEP Chemicals in Geneva and say, hey, this is how we're going to do it, and now we're going to push that down to all countries in the world. So it really needs to be a very fine-grained approach. And there is a lot of work now with various experts to come up with a relatively cheap and effective mercury-free alternatives, and they are. It's just sort of try to tailor them as much as possible to individual mining communities, and then also try to ensure that when you do burn off the mercury, you use retorts or other type of technologies that captures mercury. So for most countries with ASGM, the short-term goal is to reduce mercury use and exposure, and the long-term goal is to phase out mercury use. But Zimbabwe and a lot of other countries are discovering that this is not something you can do in 24 hours. This is not something that you can do in a year either. This is a long-term problem that requires a long-term solution. That's why they have this sort of parallel efforts of short-term efforts focusing on reducing mercury use and exposure, and the more long-term goal of phasing it out. Did that answer the question? I hope. Yeah.
Any closing remarks that you might want to
just
share?
Want to say thank you for coming. The book is out, as Kevin mentioned. We also have the website that have more information. And if anyone have any questions about the book or the mercury issue, please reach out to me or Noelle. It's our last name, Selin, and then either at bu.edu or at mit.edu. And we're happy to continue chatting with any one of you. So thank you, Kevin, very much for hosting this. And Maureen, thank you very much for organizing this. It's been great to be here.
Great. Well, congratulations on behalf of the GDP Center and the Pardee School for this great book for you and Noelle. We put links to the webpage for the book where you can go order it and learn more about these stories. This talk and conversation that we had today will soon be on the GDP Center YouTube page and a link to a blog piece on our webpage. I want to invite everyone back tomorrow morning to have to continue this conversation in a different way. We'll be having a presentation at 9 a.m. in our Global China Research Colloquium on physical climate risks and overseas investment. And then next Monday, we'll have a very interesting event with Mia Motley and Gordon Brown as part of a GDP Center event recommending a global debt relief for a green and inclusive recovery. You can find out about all this and more if you follow us on Twitter or go to our webpage, which you can see over my right shoulder right here. Thanks so much to Henrik Selin. Congratulations, and we'll see everybody soon.